Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothkushel.
Well, Jeremy, I'm sure everybody who's listening knows the big news of the past week, so we don't need to really, discuss exactly what happened, which was the obviously the killing of Iran's leader of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, uh, Qasem Soleimani. Basically, this would be the equivalent, I would think, of a U.S. four-star general or a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff being killed. Or somebody pointed out this would be the equivalent of General Petraeus or somebody like him going to, maybe it might have been you who made this equivalency, going to Toronto and being killed in a similar manner than how Soleimani was. And then an enemy of the U.S. justifies it by saying that he was a threat to their country. So.
Yeah, I mean, in a certain way, it's maybe because of sort of Soleimani's role in as a sort of special operations or special forces general of some sort. Really, you could almost compare it to the assassination of like the head of like a special forces general, like a McRaven,
Sure.
or who was the guy in charge in Afghanistan.
McChrystal.
McChrystal, something like that. But it definitely is the case. You know, this was at the Baghdad International Airport in a sovereign country, Iraq.
Yeah.
And so it would be similar to something like Petraeus flying into Toronto International Airport and more we're learning now that there was a possibility that the lure of Soleimani to right there on that day might have even been very much related to something like an alleged brokered peace offering or a de-escalation or a moderating of the relationship between potentially the Saudis and the Iranians. And if that's the case, and that is what the Iraqi prime minister reported to the Iraqi parliament yesterday, I believe, right before they voted to kick the U.S. military out of Iraq, then that would be one of such an evil, wicked deception, and it would be parallel to something like Petraeus flying into Toronto International Airport for an alleged peace conference of some sort, and then being assassinated by a drone by Iran or something like that. You can imagine what that would be like. And then in the wake of it, of course, with Trump having been the one who's recognized to have pulled the trigger, now there's also some very interesting stories that the Pentagon, since September 11th, has laid out an array of options to American presidents, which include the maybe most extreme, most aggressive military and violent operations also on the table, supposedly to make the more moderate things seem more palatable. That's what some of the press is saying, and that they were actually surprised that Trump chose the assassination of Soleimani. And then what it also shows is that there's basically only yes men in the command structure, basically, if that is the case, and they just followed out this. This is obviously a war crime of some sort, if not terrorism at some level too.
Well, let's hold on to that and go back into that, because I think we're going to discuss some of these. Some of this as we go on here, and so you do have this. This is the equivalent, I guess, of a combination of a major American, military leader, and also in some ways as revered as, I'm not on the ground in Iran. I don't know what the on the ground type of atmosphere is in Iran, but Soleimani was a very respected figure in Iran. So this is also the equivalent of a combination of a military leader and also a very well revered American person of distinguishment going into a foreign country and basically being assassinated, and then having it justified by saying that this person was a serious threat to your country. So you have this, and this is a very, very serious at the very least, obviously a very extremely serious provocation. And once again, you talk about putting the it's just one of my thoughts coming out of this. You talk about putting the shoe on the other foot as far as some of the language that Trump has used in the aftermath of this. Like, for example, the threatening that there are 53 Iranian sites that the U.S. has targeted if Iran tries to retaliate, alluding to the 53 American hostages who were taken in 52 American hostages who were taken in 1979. If he wanted to, he could use the number 53 to indicate the 1953 overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, but I don't think he'd do that. But just imagine this. I mean, that's cultural sites. That's all kinds of violations of any type of international law, or even any type of norms of being a normal, good human being, and wanting to threatening basically to destroy entire the cultural heritage of a country, destroying the sites and the cities that they most hold. It's the equivalent of threatening to bomb. Let's say threatening to bomb Mount Rushmore, threatening to bomb the Lincoln Memorial, or threatening to bomb the Golden Gate Bridge. All of those. Imagine just if the shoe was on the other foot. Just imagine if someone even alluded to that. But now, Trump, with little pushback. I think you mentioned that George Stephanopoulos on ABC yesterday was actually somewhat pushed Mike Pompeo on this matter of this threat by Trump, and it would basically the criminal nature of it, but very little pushback in general from the media outside of, and from the establishment outside of a few celebrities rightly making noise about it, who are being just ridiculed in the the right wing media sphere. So
right, so I heard Chuck Todd was trying to interrupt or interject in Mike Pompeo's interview to make that point and the question about the Geneva Convention, and then just sort of just got pushed around by Pompeo and failed to actually get the question out, and then thanked him for his time. Thanks for coming and explaining to it. And George Stephanopoulos did get the question out about, this is clearly in violation of Geneva Convention international legal norms around the targeting of cultural sites, civilian sites. It's heads in the direction of threatening cultural genocide, which was already accomplished in a devastating fashion in relationship to the invasion of Iraq.
Yes, so true.
So there is an aspect of this where none of the Democrats or the candidates actually seem to have called out Trump for this. That is terrorism. What Trump is doing on Twitter to his 60-something million followers.
Yeah, all you're getting
because he's threatening a war crime. He hasn't committed the war crime yet, but he's making terrorist threats. Really, that are he's threatening to violate the Geneva Convention, which I would remind people that part of the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, and those who are oath sworn to defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that includes the kind of international obligations that the United States, that we signed on to in post-World War II in relationship to the Geneva Conventions. That is international law, and that is constitutional ruling law, unless we're going to actually say that we no longer openly abide by that. But of course, that people, a lot of the sort of the Democratic mainstream is going to say this is just another proof that this Trump administration is a complete disruption and a violation of our American traditions and sensibility. And yet what it really is, especially in a post 9/11 context, is just the next logical step of open lawlessness that American presidents have proposed. And I would just conclude that thought pattern by pointing out post 9/11, you then have the torture regime, which was not overt at first, right? Remember, it was covertly done, and it wasn't just torture. Remember, it was also rendition, right? So there's a problem with habeas corpus first, that you're being snatched off the street extrajudicially anywhere around the world by the U.S. Intelligence services, and then if you're a target in terms of the terror war, then you potentially, your body can then, after being seized, it can then be subjected, which in an American Bill of Rights context would be a violation of the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, right? Okay, so that's all in violation of the Geneva Accords. But then additionally, then people say, oh, Obama came in and he stopped the torture. We tortured some folks, but we don't do that anymore. Right, because
we
then
he look forward and not backwards.
Yeah, right. We need right. That's a good point, Greg. He not only then expanded that, and I would point out that in order to go forward and not look backwards, he not only didn't try under international law and American law those people who advocated and legalized or made legal policy of torture in the United States of America. He also expanded the lawlessness. He tripled down on it to some extent under the guise of reversing the torture regime. Remember, he promised to close down Guantanamo and to end torture. He ended torture, allegedly, okay, but he never closed down Guantanamo. So what he decided to do in a highly cynical and I would say a wicked fashion was to basically, instead of having the ugly problem of having black sites and an expanding population, captive population in Guantanamo, he decided to vaporize people instead, which included just people, families, children, women, and probably most of the people that he vaporized who were the actual targets were just people who were fighting against invading troops in their own countries, right? They weren't planning attacks against American civilians, i.e. terrorism, the war on terror. And so Obama very cynically increased the open lawlessness of the United States government globally in the wake of the 9/11 terror wars by deciding to solve the torture problem by expanding it into a drone, a Hellfire missile, scorched earth and body policy solution. And so now just to sort of having the president openly do terrorist threats on Twitter against civilian people and cultural sites in direct violation of our terrorist laws in the United States of America and against the Geneva Convention is just, in a certain way, the next logical step of this absurdly wicked and illegal post 9/11 policy. So once again, and we'll see this, Mike Pence making the 9/11 alleged connection to Soleimani. 9/11 is still the issue, and very few people want to deal with it. How many people have actually asked serious questions or made serious statements in the actual public sphere, at actual public fora in the United States of America in the post 9/11 era? Very, very few. It's uncomfortable. I know. I do it. I've tried. Sometimes I've been cowardly and I've not said something when I should have said something. It is very uncomfortable, but more and more we realize if we do not root out this massive treasonous deception of September 11th, this is just going nowhere good. It's already gone nowhere good. It's already been resulted in the deaths of millions of people worldwide, both directly and indirectly. And then also the death, really, I would say the 9/11 wars have probably been responsible for destroying the lives of hundreds of thousands of American people, maybe more if you factor in the opium and heroin policy of reinforcing Afghanistan poppy production and how many people's lives that's destroyed. But there are at least 100,000 American veterans who've been involved in these post 9/11 dirty wars who have committed suicide that would not have I don't believe, a large amount of them would not have committed suicide if they hadn't been involved in these dirty wars.
Absolutely right, and that's something people forget about, like when you talk about the war on terror and people who just, you get into some of the very rabidly, pro-war, pro-military circles, and it's the kind of people who, I've heard this casually a few times amongst relatives, the kind of people who have this mentality of, well, we're just we're we've got to do what we've got to do to win these wars. It's the mentality of, I mean, I've heard this said before: kill them all and let God or Allah or sort them out. And then when it's actually brought up the nature of provable criminality, then it's justified by there's denial of the idea you committed war crimes. There's a denial of it, and then when there's actual evidence that's put out there of it, it becomes justifiable. Well, we did what we had to do to win. But in the context of that kind of mentality, people don't think about, it's not just, as horrible as it is, and this is it's not just and this is, I would say, this is even a criticism of someone like Noam Chomsky on his lack of willingness to address September 11th when it comes to as opposed to other historical events such as the U.S. actions in Indochina, Southeast Asia, Latin America over the decades, which of course is very important. But people don't think about the cost that it had to Americans. I mean, all these stupid, Sean Hannity types who constantly talk about how much they support the military, wave their flags, and do these military fundraisers, but they're not telling you about the effects the war is having on American personnel. I remember there was a video of George Bush at the White House press correspondence dinner searching for the weapons of mass destruction, having a big old laugh superimposed with photos of American flag coffins draped in American flags of American soldiers coming home from Iraq dead. And so,
you're right, a big joke. And Obama did a similar kind of joke where he joked about like being the drone king and how he's going to use Predator drones on the Jonas Brothers if they looked at his daughters or something. Sickos.
Yeah, and then Trump, so many times you can't even begin to think about how many times Trump is, quote, joked about that kind of stuff. I mean, it's much, much worse on him. But the point I was making about 9/11 and Chomsky is that you think about the effects of the consequences that this has had on other people in the world and and unfortunately, this is a sad fact of the matter. A lot of Americans, unfortunately, this is just an unfortunate truth, does not justify anything, and it shows a lack of empathy. It shows a really sickening, in some ways, kind of American exceptionalism to where, Americans are the only people who really matter in the world at the end of the day. But, a lot of people are not going to react to who they perceive as the enemy being, slaughtered by the American military machine. What they are going to respond to is the fact of the criminality being committed against the United States, against Americans, events like September 11th, and the truth about that. And then, you get the truth about this and you reveal to people that these wars are just completely based on fabrications. Then the outrage will come about things like the Iraq War and the hell on earth that has been wrought upon so many people in the aftermath of the September 11th wars, and even things like there would be no justification for Soleimani in September 11th if the truth about this was out. And so once again, we're seeing that this continues to be one of the major litmus tests of vital importance, and it continues to become, as you've said, and I agree with you, more and more important as time goes on.
I completely agree with you in terms of now you got me thinking, and it makes me really angry about the way that like the left of like these big icons have treated this as if it's like September 11th specifically in an American context. Because remember, the way that Amy Goodman usually treats it is that when 9/11 comes up, she almost always just sort of and today is another anniversary of September 11th. Meanwhile, let's have a Noam Chomsky on to talk about 9/11 in Chile from the 1970s for the 100th time. And of course that was an important moment, the Chilean coup and Henry Kissinger and all of that. But can you imagine what, then you add in Noam Chomsky or even people like Mike Preisner, sort of veterans against the war and sort of so-called principled left, where they disparage people who want to deal with 9/11 was a war crime against the American people. It was. And it was by the same people and the same power networks that then use that to perpetrate the ongoing war crimes and terrorism against the people of Southeast Asia, of the Middle East, of Iraq. This is the same network. And yes,
Yeah.
it's important. We're not trying to say that the suffering of the American people on September 11th is any more important.
That's what Mike Preisner tried to do years ago when he was on Twitter, saying that is he the only person who thinks 9/11 truth is racist. I think that tweet's since been deleted now, basically insinuating are 3,000 Americans more important than 1 million dead Iraqis? No, but the truth about the deaths of the 3,000 Americans could lead us to the truth about the death of 1 million plus Iraqis.
Yes, the deaths of the people on September 11th. And remember, there was thousands of dead Americans. There was also dead people from probably a quarter to a third of the countries around the world on that day. So it was obviously an act of terrorism and a global war crime that was then used to set a fire to the world that continues to this day. And so obviously September 11th and a truthful analysis of who did it and why is still key. Obviously, people are talking about World War III in a sort of semi-joking, blithe manner in terms of the assassination of Soleimani. But let's remember that if anybody takes that threat seriously, and of course, those threats are serious, because even if that's not the plan, when you get sovereign countries against each other that have lots of weapons and that you can, people start taking sides, things can happen, right? Things can happen. And so the fact that is even a threat and that this was all done under the regime of the war on terror. Remember, that's how this was justified, was because remember when this happened, when, it was just earlier, months ago, in the middle of 2019, I think, when the Trump administration decided to label the entirety of the IRGC in Iran as a terrorist organization, right? And so that's what you hear all over the news now.
And now you're hearing about the reiteration of 20 Obama era propaganda of the sleeper cells. The Iranians and Hezbollah and these other terror groups have sleeper cells ready to go. They're ready to kill Americans in our own cities if we're not vigilant. So that's another 9/11 enabled narrative that is really seems to be picking up steam in certain corridors as well.
And the problem is that may be true, and that's part of the issue here too, is that it not only facilitates the ability for there to be false flags and for it to be blamed on Iranian response, but the fact that this would then also be about, well, how is Iran going to actually respond to this? And are there elements in Iran that are benefiting from this, who are in the know even potentially, or at the very least are happy that this happened, either for domestic political purposes and Soleimani being sort of clear, being someone to clear out of the way for political reasons, and or to further the war footing of the aspect of there is a Persian expansionism in relationship to the clean break wars in the Middle East. And it is the case that Iran is a deeply strategic society in terms of their long-term thinking. Mm-hmm. This is different than the sort of Al-Qaeda threat. This is much more real in certain ways, and not only in terms of potential cyber attacks, but also the presence of cells. And so this is a very dangerous moment. And so if the Iranian government and leadership were serious about a devastating response to this, let's say, what they would do is they would muster as much international credibility in doing a few things. First of all, they would expose September 11th. And, we've been talking about this. This is, in a certain way, this is proof that Putin is not he's obviously not a actual opponent of the terror war regime. And, we've gone over things about how it's pretty clear that he actually came to power based on a false flag terror regime, the apartment bombings and all that, that anticipated September 11th. And then post 9/11, come on. Does anyone really believe that the sort of high-level intelligence services around the world, including Russian intelligence, doesn't have the actual goods on September 11th? Whether it's the actual physical forensics from Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan, or the Pentagon, or the background actually of, you remember everyone saying, oh, Israel warned the United States, oh, Russia warned the United States. Okay, so there's a lot of people that know what happened on September 11th. So that's one thing. If Iranian leadership is serious about a devastating response to the actual people who orchestrated this assassination, then what they will do is organize a international response that is truth-based, that goes to the heart of 9/11.
And I would add an international, what you're talking about here, that is not soiled by the likes of people like Alexander Dugin being primarily involved.
Yes, not the New Horizons conference where it's sort of Dugin is the major convener or figure of the East, who's such a cynical player at the very best. At the very best, he's a cynical player who plays all sides of the propaganda, horizon. If he's not just, which it looks like, he's not just an operator of the Russian deep state, which is obviously what he actually is. And so no, not New Horizons sort of built for Western dissidents. No, I'm talking actual a full-on international conference or a gathering, and this could include like other Muslim nations like Malaysia, but it should also, you got to know that there's other aspects of the West that have been putting out information that includes like even France and England. And there's elements in the United States that, if given the opportunity, would probably take it as an opportunity to speak out. So that's one thing. And obviously that's not just out of left field when you have the Vice President of the United States of America trying to tag the target of the assassination of a quote unquote terrorist with also being involved potentially in 9/11. Okay, so 9/11 is still front and center. Secondly, the truth about the clean break agenda. Okay, and still you have no one out there. I did hear Max Blumenthal talking to Jimmy Dore, explaining some aspect of the clean break paper, and yet still he acts as if he hasn't actually read it, where he basically does not actually talk about what Syria was. It was not a regime change war. It was a rollback war, and it was different than Iraq. And so
Blumenthal, along with so many others in the so-called alternative media, they have such a vested interest based on their talking points and what they're promoting to continue to push uncritically that without any type of nuance or any type of other possible scenarios, other possible explanations, that this was simply, it's the evil U.S. deep state in the West, the neoliberal establishment and neocon establishment in the U.S. They're all lumped together as one, by the way, with their European allies in Israel and Saudi Arabia, just a monolithic effort for regime change in Syria, and there's no other explanation. So, I think a lot of people have a vested interest in keeping that alive.
Yeah, and Jimmy Dore just discovered the Patrick Clausen at Washington Institute for Near East Policy infamous quote from 2013, maybe 2012 even, something like that, talking about the history of crisis initiation in the U.S. context, and then talking about how we're in the game, folks, in relationship to how we can get a U.S. president to war with Iran. And that was under the Obama administration. And then Jimmy Dore ends up actually cutting off the last part of it where Clausen actually talks about covert operations. And yes, the problem, of course, with like someone like Max Blumenthal and Jimmy Dore is, for whatever reason, from good faith to bad faith explanations, they are so invested in accusing anybody who does an analysis of Russian influence as just being sort of neo-McCarthyites, or this is all a nothing burger. This is just conspiracy theories. You're in bed with the establishment Democrats and the corporate mainstream media. That they cannot do a full analysis because they are stuck on Russiagate as a nothing burger. So then things that begin to make sense about all of the certain different parties that might be benefiting from this latest incident, they sort of cannot get there, because one of the factors that you would see then is this obviously begins to threaten the oil markets. That's one of the sort of severe options that Iran might have over the longer term, is shutting down oil flow in relationship to their region at least. And then, as you see, immediately after this Soleimani assassination, the Russian oil markets, I believe, reached their highest level ever. I believe that's true. So that is a serious factor here. And as you obviously see, there is a Netanyahu-Putin factor here. And Putin will be visiting Netanyahu later in the month. And so before laying out the third piece that a severely strategic and rational Iranian leadership would do if they're serious about responding to this rather than escalating this, I just want to point out what I believe actually happened here, is that this question of Donald Trump potentially having played a role in luring Soleimani in relationship to an alleged peace proposal or a mediation proposal with the Saudis. It is very possible that Donald Trump was also played in the matter of this. And there is an interesting article put out by Gordon Duff on Veterans Today that's titled "Faked Israeli Intercept Pushes Trump into War. Fool Me Once. What is the real war? Is it Iran against America or Israel against America?" And this was put out January 4th, 2020. And what's interesting about this is that it establishes the question of Unit 8200 Israeli signals intelligence, false flag communications as crucial through a lot of this. That includes, I remind people, this question of Syria, the planting of rocks that were actually Unit 8200 false communicator devices in Syria in relationship to things like false flag chemical attacks. But this also goes way back to even the 80s, right? The discotheque bombing, I think it was, in Berlin, in Germany, that killed Marines, was then used as there was Trojan horse devices planted by Israeli intelligence.
By the way, these are more examples here of a refusal or an inability, of people, researchers, various Chomsky-esque icons of the American of discourse that we were talking about earlier. This is another example, even going back further than September 11th. Obviously, none of these events had the effect of September 11th, but still, just the ability for these events to stand the test of time as the quote-unquote official narrative without really any serious major pushback from people with influence or really major platforms to make a serious difference. These are just more examples of that, what you're about to lay out here. The question surrounding something like the 1986 discotheque bombing or the 1983 Lebanon Marine barracks bombings. I just want to throw that in there.
Yes. So that the 80s, there's a lot of resonance with that era of the early 80s of what you're referring to there in terms of the 1983 multiple bombings that were both, there was multiple targets, and the sourcing of that is very interesting, and I think we need to do more research on it specifically, because I think it's a crucial moment, and it reminds me actually of the USS Liberty attack, because it's really done in the wake of like aggressive Israeli warfare, trying to shut down potential outside and international observers. What was the purpose of that? It looks like to me. And so then this question of the attack on Gaddafi's compound and family in the 80s was predicated upon this discotheque bombing that killed Marines. So there's that, there's that sort of resonance with this current moment of, this man was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of American soldiers. And so there is that resonance here of like Gaddafi in this case, there's actually, there's truth to it because of the question of the Iraq War and who's fighting on what side. Of course, they leave out the part where Soleimani was actually teamed up with the American military in relationship to against the Taliban and against ISIS, of course. And but in the 1980s Libyan context, that was very largely, I imagine, it looks like it was completely fabricated, this Gaddafi connection. And but the resonance of that, where it's sold to the American leadership and an American audience of this man was responsible for the killing of our Marines, and then you have Israeli intelligence planning these Trojan horse communication devices in territorial Libya, and then it being picked up by NSA, these sort of false communications for there to be the framing of Gaddafi. Okay, so I believe that was very likely what happened here. Is that Unit 8200 was creating false signals intelligence that was potentially then utilized and fed to Trump and a U.S. context, his national security people, that Soleimani was, yes, he had been invited and was showing up to potentially have respond to this Saudi initiated mediation or peace entree, but Soleimani was actually showing up to orchestrate in a further attack on the U.S. embassy or a further attack on U.S. forces. And so that's what I imagine is in the mix here to have justified this attack, because they're not saying it's U.S. intelligence that is the source of the intelligence that Soleimani was that they were trying to interrupt a Soleimani attack on American forces. So my sense is the way how guarded they're being and how delicate the situation seems is that this is once again a case of where this was fed to Trump and the U.S. via Israeli sources, very likely connected to Netanyahu. And so I have pointed out that there's resonance of September 11th once again here. It seems like it, where the Saudis are in the mix. And it's very possible this was all very cynical, and that yes, it did look like that there was beginning to be some kind of detente or a lessening of tension between Saudi and Iran in the recent months. But it's very possible, especially when you look at what the Trump conspiracy, the 11/9 operation, the Red Sea conspiracy, as Seth Abramson has drawn it out in terms of the actual forces that supported Trump into the White House, that this was very cynical and that the Saudis and MBS basically allowed themselves to be used as a lure or a dangle for Soleimani to be targeted. And this is similar again to September 11th, and that the Saudis played the role of playing the pretext of supplying the patsy nationals to then be blamed, and then the Israelis did the framing and supplied the long-term strategic national security objectives for the reason for the terrorist attack. And then the United States military supplied the lethal muscle in the wake of it. So I get the sense that something very similar has happened. And this, of course, makes total sense in relationship to all of these strains we've been tracking around the people who put Trump into power and Trump himself. And we pointed out over and over again that the very first public reason that Trump gave in 2015 for running for president was about the Iran deal. It was about how it was such a bad Iran nuclear deal and that he was going to pull out of it and fix it or something like that. And so I would say that this is the logical extension. We all could have seen this coming.
Yes.
In both a post 9/11 context and a post 11/9 context.
Yeah, you're so right, and I'm glad you're laying out this theory. And this is what it is. It's theory. It's taking information that's out there, taking evidence, and laying out a possible scenario for this. And I believe it's as plausible as anything else that's out there for sure. And I mean, we do need to look at these things, and that's one of the reasons why we have to take into consideration when going back to what you talked about earlier, the Russian factor, the factor of what is called the multipolar world. And what you were saying earlier about people who need to come out, nobody's coming out and being honest about the nature of much less of the Trump operation, really, much less September 11th. And I actually, you might say, I guess I tried to lay out a challenge. I didn't get everything I wanted to say on the record to Lee Stranahan on his Sputnik show this morning, Fault Lines. But I basically said that, if you're really going to condemn Trump over this action and be seriously critical of this action, instead of just mocking Sebastian Gorka's accent and saying that this is bad this is bad and this is a bad move, lay out the nature of what's actually behind Trump. And I listed off Steve Bannon and Cambridge Analytica and Eric Prince and Joel Zamel and Cy Group, as well as the Council for National Policy. And I wanted to go further into it and lay out some of Lee Stranahan's strange bedfellows that he keeps with regards to continuing to associate with the likes of Jerome Corsi and Jim Hoft to the Gateway Pundit, all over this desire, it seems like, to completely poo-poo any types of collusion narratives. But so in talking to Stranahan, I was, let's be honest about the nature of this. And he kind of just dismissed it and said that, well, I would have agreed with you if you said that these people were using Trump, but he's not. They don't control him or anything. He's used by them. And so, it's just something to throw out there on the record as far as, and I might actually go into a solo audio of my own, elaborating on what I tried to call in about this morning. But, you would see more and more people, if they're really outraged about this, especially people who are in the know, like Lee Stranahan, who is as much of an insider to anybody as the inner workings of Breitbart and the Mercer Empire, start blowing the whistle on this stuff instead of just continuing to portray Trump as the populist would-be hero who's being steered in the wrong direction by all the bad people. Tucker Carlson does the exact same thing on Fox News when he's pushing this is a bad move, Mr. President, don't let them draw you into a war. Expose this instead of just continuing to play dumb on this the reality of what this Trump operation is. And at the very least, even if you don't think Trump is controlled per se by these entities, he was put into office by them, he was installed by them, and everything he has done has fit you could argue pretty much everything he's done from a geopolitical perspective has fit the goals and desires, I think, of this bigger base sphere of influence that is around Trump, who were responsible for getting him into the Oval Office. Did you want to say anything about that before we move on to our last point in the last 15 minutes?
No, I did just want to say that I appreciate you making a phone call to somewhere like Fault Lines Radio, and that I just want that to serve as an example for all of us in this time where there's an escalation of threats and serious issues, to escalate the discourse and reach across different boundaries to expose these potentially more truthful and honest lines of analyses to different groups of people, to both confront deception, confront lies, confront liars, but also to inform the people. And amongst that are going to be the people who actually care enough to do something with that truth. And now is the time for all of us to speak out not only in a big way but in a discerning and wise way. So again, it's not enough, as we saw in relationship to the run up to the Iraq War. If this is, if there's an angling towards this going even hotter, which it looks like that, and how wide that escalation may go or could go or is planned to go, I don't know. But in the midst of that, we do have to act. And as we saw in the run up to the Iraq War, the idea of just sort of like having millions of people on the street saying no Iraq war is not going to cut it, especially if the analysis is not there. And so I would say, to all those who sort of get behind the Code Pink and the left organization for anti-war getting out on the streets, yes, good, get out on the streets, but at the same time, let's ask why the leadership of the so-called left and the so-called peace movement has not told any of the truth, has covered up for the war criminals who attacked Americans on September 11th. The same set of war criminals that are escalating tension and violence against the people of Iran, that continue the violence against the people of the Middle East. Okay, so I would say we can chew gum and tell the truth at the same time.
So true. And once again, she's become one of our favorite punching bags. But what you just said there about, our leadership not being honest about the nature of the war on terror and what is actually leading to all of these horrible scenarios, I got to throw Tulsi Gabbard out there again. I mean, she did an interview on Fox News where she condemned Trump for taking this action. But in the process of it, well, what was the narrative framed in? Well, this is bad for the actual enemies of America. We should be going after al-Qaeda and the people who attacked us on 9/11. So once again, she even has to throw in the September 11th myth once again on Fox while condemning Trump for assassinating us, Soleimani. So
yeah, that kind of thing where that Tulsi Gabbard is doing is just completely in line with the I would call it the criminal cover up of these sort of leftists in the post 9/11 era, of the Noam Chomskys, the Amy Goodmans, that sort of leaving it, her whole argument there and in terms of Tulsi Gabbard on Fox News is, no, it wasn't Iran that sponsored al-Qaeda on 9/11. It was Saudi Arabia that sponsored al-Qaeda on 9/11. We have to fight the war on terror more carefully and choose the right enemies.
And for those who think that Tulsi, that this is really dangerous rhetoric or whatever, as far as like threatening like the Zionist interests, go look at how Breitbart and people like John Hannity and Mike Huckabee talk about Tulsi Gabbard, if you believe that.
Yeah. All right. So I just wanted to just finish my third proposal for what a strong and wise Iranian leadership would do. It is that they would call and lead an actual international investigation into how this assassination on Soleimani et al., right? Because there was also Iraqi leadership, military leadership of Iraqi Shia military militia groups that were also killed, that they should lead an international investigation into who did this and why and how this was done. Because just like September 11th, it will expose the players that need to be exposed. And the problem, of course, is this, I believe part of the problem is, and especially in an Iranian context, is the question of the Putin-Netanyahu axis and, of course, the relationship of Putin to Iran. So that is the issue here. And in the background, of course, too, is even with Trump talking about the 52 targets and the 52 hostages, from the very beginning, the Iranian Revolution and Khomeini and the staging of the hostage crisis, there was deep involvement of similar kind of players. In that era, it was elements of the Bush CIA were involved in that. And of course, that was the domestic political considerations were electoral at some level too. Had to do with taking down Jimmy Carter was aspects a part of that, and then also the question of where did Khomeini come from, and coming in from France, and what was the role of the background of all of that. So there is this aspect of, I at some level I feel like I'm just, I'm articulating a wise policy that there are not players there who can actually, it's not their purpose. It's not what they're about. That's my concern. But I just wanted to say that that's my third part of the proposal is an immediate international investigation into what is clearly a violation of the rules of war. I mean, we could talk about whether it's fair. I don't think it's fair actually for that that U.S. soldiers or Iraqi and Iranian soldiers and or civilians are the ones who catch the brunt in war, and yet the leadership, the sort of higher levels, the brass, and in this case, a leadership like
Kissinger's quote about military men attributed to Kissinger about military men being cattle, basically.
Yeah, right. To just be sort of used as pawns, which is what it looks like. And so I don't believe that they're ethically fair, those rules about how you can't really target military leadership per se if they're not in the actual battlefield. But there's something to that, especially in relationship to the idea of national sovereignty and of not a targeting for assassination, high-level political leadership, policy leadership. It's not a world that we want to live in, where including in an American context, where political leadership is persistently being targeted for potential drone attacks all around the world. That's not what we want to do. So it's very obvious that just because they called this guy a terrorist is the only way that they're really able to justify this thing legally, I think. And so the question is, if this was then a false flag operation of some sort, where the intelligence was a setup, it was actually a Unit 8200 Netanyahu-directed intel fraud, like has already been perpetrated against other leaders in the region, such as Gaddafi in the 80s, then that would actually then create the context to unpack a lot of this criminality. And so I would urge the wiser heads to look in that direction.
Yes, and I don't see the harm. Obviously, a real international, truth commission, you could call it. I don't know what the term would be for it, but we certainly need this, and I think we need much more than just Russian state media outlets in the U.S. basically. Evil America's at it again. Yankee go home, which is one of the possible aspects of this that needs to be taken into consideration. Is now Iraq is demanding that American troops leave, and for people who don't want an American presence in that region and the possible consequences of that, that's another thing to be taken into consideration. But we need more than just simply America bad, America and Israel bad. We need more than blame, the Jews or blame whoever, and just garden variety, just blaming of enemies and boogeymen. And we need much more than this. We need actual conversation on the really, really detailed, serious conversations about the nature of these types of operations and the historical nature of them, the players involved, and all of the players involved, not just some of the players involved. That's not to say we have all the answers, but I think that in some ways, I think we're closer than a lot of other people are in terms of our commentary, in terms of the depths of the amount of players involved in these kind of things. We need more sophisticated narratives than just simply using this as a battering ram against the U.S. or to fit into framings of blaming, Jews or blaming capitalism or blaming blaming militarism. It's got to be much more than that. And those are all things that need to be taken into consideration, perhaps not as weaponized as they are, but we have to have real conversations about who's to blame. Let's get to the bottom of it. Let's find out. Let's get the facts out there and let's put it out there without all this other stuff that's in there to distract and ultimately divide people. And so we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left here. And I just want to finish off by saying just wanted to talk about the nature of going back earlier when I talked about, you actually mentioned it, Jeremy, you actually mentioned it, that this is something that people who were evaluating the Trump campaign, the Trump administration, could have seen coming from the beginning. And while I'm not so sure that the goal of this administration is actually to achieve regime change in Iran, certainly I'm been skeptical that there's going to be a major war launched against Iran, like a physical military war, but more of a covert style destabilization campaign in Iran, possibly. Taking that aside, putting questions of a multipolar angle to this aside, and of this possibly even being a move to ultimately lessen U.S. influence in that region and pave the way for other powers to take over, taking all that out from a very basic perspective, looking at Donald Trump, looking at the people who surrounded him, surrounded his campaign, who were in his support base, when you get this simplistic narrative of the neocons being never Trump and not supporting him, and you take that away, the people who were around him, what you pointed out, the reason why Trump said he was running for office was one of the major reasons he threw his hat into the ring was the Iran deal, calling it the worst deal ever. I mean, being so close to Breitbart and the obvious Israeli fifth serious, really hard, the really serious hardcore elements of the Zionist movement in the United States, people could have seen what was coming, just like the Jerusalem embassy move and the Golan Heights and the anti-Semitism law that Trump put into place. People could have seen it, should have seen what was going to come next, but instead we've got so many people who are either feigning ignorance or just outright lying to you about the nature of what this presidency represents, either from the right claiming that Trump is just, he's either can do no wrong or else he's being manipulated by bad people, or you've got the left telling you that there is no collusion, there is, don't focus on this and that. And people, whether they knowingly or unknowingly, are continuing to just pretend like they don't know the deal with what's going on with this Trump operation. And we could have told you from the beginning, there were people who were saying, these kind of things are the inevitable steps of putting someone in office like Trump, who has the kind of people around him that he has and is influenced by the types of people that are in his ear all the time, that are closest to him. And just because somebody like John Bolton left, that is not out of the equation whatsoever. And in matter of fact, I think it's getting worse over time instead of getting better or getting less tempered.
Yeah. So we're in our last minute now, Greg. And I just want to put in a plug for us to dig deep at this moment and to consider the combination of intention, of prayer, in relationship to peace, principle, and freedom, but all of that in relationship to action. And part of action is the vocalization of the truth as one knows it. And so I'm proposing that we start there. Any last comments, Greg, in our last 30 seconds?
Yeah, we must speak the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. We must not veer away on these vital topics. We've got to speak as honestly as we can.
Yes, and so we will continue to do our best here at the Antidote, and so I guess until next week, Greg. Appreciate your time, and I appreciate folks listening.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
All right, bye for now.